Getting ready to hit the record, I guess. All right, and I just want to do, let's see, Tara, do you have any announcements before I introduce Ken here? Tara?
No, nothing from me. Just welcome, Ken.
All right. So I'm going to do a real quick introduction because I want Ken to just have most of the time. But I wanted to say, and if you go to his website, kendallhaven.com, very cool website and really interesting bio there. And I'm not going to read the entire thing because it goes over several pages. But Ken here is a West Point graduate, first one to ever become a professional storyteller. That's pretty fascinating. And then you study oceanography at Oregon State University.
Right.
So that's a kind of different career path. And then you spent several years, and a lot of us are feds, senior research scientist for the Department of Energy. And then at that point, you said you found your passion for storytelling, and you have been all over the map on storytelling. You have just a list of awards and things you've done, and the two great books. And that's how I found you, was Story Proof and Story Smart. Great books there. And one of the things
the next book in that series is about due to I've been stalling on writing it, but I'm up to the point now where the next book is pretty well self-written, and I just have to put it together. So there'll be one more in that series.
Oh yeah, where I saw you at was at the Storytelling and Organizations meeting. Just absolutely entranced by what you were talking about, especially the neuroscience of story. And I said, we got to get this guy for the knowledge management community. So that's how I found you, and that's why I wanted you to come here and talk to us. So I'm going to shut up now and let you start going.
All right. Good afternoon to everyone. So the topic for today is your brain on story. But really what it is about the brains of the people with whom you want to communicate. And the difficulties in that communication that lie along the pathway, but mostly along the pathway between sensory organs, mostly eyes and ears, and the conscious mind. And unfortunately, that is a very convoluted and complex pathway, and involves a lot about story. And so that understanding story lets you understand that pathway, which is then a key to understanding communication in general. And in particular, what we're playing with is the accuracy of communication. Yeah, let me start here. I'll just do one quick little anecdotal story. It happened in 2002. It was just about, well, it was tomorrow, 2002. Today actually is my birthday, and it happened the day after my birthday in the year 2002, which was the year I turned 55. Now, for a number of years before that, I had been an itinerant touring storyteller and doing little side bits of research for the storytelling community. But I earned my living out on the stump, telling stories and hoping that people would be willing to pay for it. And for some reason, that birthday hit me, and it hit me for the first time that I actually was going to be growing old. And how long could I be out touring the world trying to tell stories in order to make enough money to pay rent and put food on the table? It was the first time I had ever really thought about growing old and the disadvantages of it, and the fact that I wasn't really enthused about the idea of growing old. Next day, I was in the little town of Mariposa, California, gold rush town, up in the foothills of the Sierras. I was going to spend the day at the high school. I was checked out of my motel room. Again, this is a small town, and I like to have a leisurely breakfast. Checked out at 6:15. I had to be at the high school at 7:40. Wanted time to read the paper, have breakfast, a cup of coffee, get ready. Checking out of a motel means sliding your key through a slot in the office door because no one was going to be in the office until 8. After I had done that, and so was out of my room, I realized that there were only 2 restaurants in town that served breakfast, and neither opened until 7. The only place that was open was a Burger King. Big long line of cars because people buy houses up in the hills because they're cheap and then commute down to Sacramento and Stockton, the valley towns where the pay is better for work. So they all load up at the Burger King for the drive down the hill. I went inside because I didn't want to wait in the car line. Up to the counter, girl came up to wait on me. If you told me she was 12, I would have believed you. But I'm sure she actually was older than that, probably at least 16, maybe even 18. I said, 1 cup of coffee, small coffee, black. She looked at me, smiled, big customer service smile, and said, pointing to a sign on the wall to her left, senior citizen discount? I looked at the sign. It said for our valued customers 65 and older, coffee that was usually $1.05 is now $1.25. I said, wow, that's a great deal. But I got to tell you, I'm nowhere near 65. Big customer service smile. She looked at me and said, and this is a quote, oh, that's okay. You look way plenty old enough to me. Now, there's a follow-on to this story, but the immediate aftermath was, I was livid. I had just been mortally wounded and insulted. I boycotted Burger King for a decade because of that. I found out later from one of the people that's a teacher at the high school that I was working with, that girl had applied to be Employee of the Month and had used that exchange as an example of the superior nature of her customer service. Same event, the same interaction, and 2 radically different stories walked away from it. My question to you is, which one matters? And if we were alive, we could all talk about that a little bit. I'll just roll on. And of course, the one that matters was mine. Why? I am, for that company, they're trying to communicate to me the only story that matters is the story that forms in the mind of the target audience. And that's where story science begins to be able to provide some insights. We find that there is a significant difference between what gets said and what gets heard. So that the key question is not, did I say what I wanted to say? It's, did they actually hear consciously what I need for them to hear? And it's not always easy to tell because they think whatever they heard is exactly what you said or wrote. And the same thing happens when they're reading articles and letters, position papers, blogs. So also, as we're going along, feel free for anyone to jump in and say, wait a minute, hold on, that doesn't make sense to me. Or wait a minute, I don't believe that for a second. You're going to have to back that one up. Everything I say today, I can back up with extensive, both in-lab audience testing, EEG and fMRI lab testing, and then a whole host of other research activities that have gone on over the years. But what we then come up to, I jumped ahead a little bit. Key question, let's go down one more slide. There we go. Take a step back for just a moment. If we look at the word storytelling, a lot of people sort of lump storytelling in just a thing when they talk about what I do. But there are 2 halves to that word, story and telling. Story is a noun. It's a physical thing. It's an asset. You can trade it, sell it, steal it, treat it like any other valuable asset. Telling is a verb. It's an interactive process. The 2 are totally separate. The skill sets, the concerns, the issues, the development path for those 2 are completely different. We're going to talk about the story half, but I wanted to do just a nod to the storytelling half before we do. And I want to see if we can do this. Are you in charge of everyone's mic so that you can mute or unmute them? Is that true? And can we all unmute ourselves for just a moment? And
everyone can unmute themselves.
Okay, unmute yourself for just a moment. And Jamie, your job is kind of as moderator. Normally we would just go around the room. Well, we can't go around the room, so you're going to have to direct people, just go from person to person. It's real simple, real short. Since we're going to be together for 45 minutes, I just want to say hi in this way. Jamie, I'll say hi to you. You will then turn, say hi to the next person and designate who that is. They'll say hi to they'll say on to the next person. Here, there's only one rule in this little game. When it's your turn to pass it on to the next person, you must say it differently than anyone before you has said it. The only rule. Just take what you hear and you're going to turn around, you're going to say the greeting on to the next person, but say it differently than anyone before you has said it. Jamie, hi.
Hi, Jim.
Hi, Jamie.
If you now
It's
pass
a
it on
new
to
person.
Did I violate?
So Jamie, you're probably going to have to direct them for who they're going,
Sure.
who's next and coming up.
So, yeah, if you all can, it's hard to do when this. Do you mind if
It's
we
very
stop the
hard.
screen share for a moment? Do
Sure.
you mind if we stop the screen share? It might be easier that way.
Okay, good.
Okay. Let's see.
I want to see if this works on Zoom. This is partly a test of whether this works on
Actually,
Zoom.
can you stop sharing, Bill?
Can
Bill's not in
I?
the seat. Or can you stop sharing, Kendall?
And so I just hit the green share button and turn that off.
All right. I guess. Well, Bill is actually the one sharing screen.
Yes, right.
So let's see if I can stop sharing his screen. Stop. Here we go. Okay. There we go.
Okay.
All right. So now everyone should be able to see people on the screen. Hi, John. And so what Kendall would like us to do is go around and say hi.
You've gotten all the rules.
Okay.
Let's just pick a name and let's go.
All right. So I said, hello, Jim. You need to pick another person.
Good afternoon, Jamie. And I only see you and me on the screen, on my screen.
Okay. How about say hello to Bill?
Elizabeth, how are you?
All right. Well, let's stop there. Let's go back and we can start resharing. It's already worked. And I'll show you something. I want to show you something. There have only been 3 people who have gone. All 3 chose to violate the one and only rule I gave them. I said, say, quote, hi, unquote, and say it differently. But because that doesn't make a lot of sense to people, we don't think about the way we're saying something. We normally focus on content in your mind, or most of what you heard was, say something different. You actually changed my direction to make it make sense to you. We do that all the time without ever knowing that we've done it. We adjust information that we're getting in, both when we're reading and certainly when we're talking, to make it make sense to you. It's a process that happens subconsciously, automatically, before information gets up to your conscious mind. So if we'd gone around the room, typically if 20 people go, there will be 1 or 2 that will actually say hi. And everyone else will start to think about some other way to say hello. And they'll start going to foreign languages. They'll go to anything rather than think that there are an infinite number of ways to take that word hi and say it. Change tone, change volume, change gestures that go with it. But we typically think first content, and so to make it make more sense, you flipped what I said. That's the problem that you face every time you try to communicate. And it's controlling that automatic make sense process in someone else's mind that is at the heart of controlling communication. And that's where story science come in. Can we come back to share the slide so I can go back to the slides?
Bill will have to share his screen again.
Yeah. Let's see. Is it? Okay. There we go. Is that good?
Well, so far it's your face,
Okay.
which is good, but it just isn't the slide I really wanted to go to next.
Okay. I'm so sorry about the remote control thing. I'm kind of not too used to this either. Let me get you back. Okay. And we're going to share that again. All right. And I'm going to give you the remote control again.
Good.
And give me just a second.
All right.
And of course, the cat wants to help me.
And there you go.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So let's.
Go ahead and hit your button and take care.
I'm doing this. I'm not controlling it. It's,
Okay. Let me give it back to you again. Okay. Here we go. Okay. Now it should work for you.
let's start, yeah.
Okay.
Um,
Do you have it now?
no, I do not.
Oh, you're moving now. Go ahead and hit the. Go ahead and one more over.
This way.
Towards your left. Okay. Hit
Down.
that. Yeah. There you go.
All right. Key question. Did I say what I wanted to say? Here we go. 2 halves of storytelling. Stories and nouns, stories and nouns. The point is, automatically, our brains adjust content to make it make sense to us, so that what one person thinks they heard can be significantly different from what another person thinks they heard, because of this make sense process. We come down to 2 key questions. How does the human brain make sense out of incoming information? And then once you've made sense out of it, how do you create meaning from it? Answer those 2 and you control communication. That's the whole idea of story science. So let's go to the first of those, the making sense part. And this is going to be real summary, headline level stuff, because there's only so much we can cover in this amount of time. Here's what everything is backed up extensively by considerable amounts of research experiment with all live human being subjects. Our brains are hardwired now to think and process in specific story terms. It's not that we learn it as children, it's that it is hardwired before birth. Not me, I don't do this research, but other people have checked and found that 2-month-old babies respond to the exact same story terms that adults do. It's there before birth. It is in our hardwiring. What's been interesting for me is to show that you turn information into story form along with that initial processing that happens before information gets to the conscious mind. When you read, you're not aware of what your brain does to reform the information that goes down the optic nerve. Letters and words don't go down the optic nerve. It's something like the dot pattern of the old cathode ray guns from a TV. It's a similar kind of a stream of dot bit size information that goes down the optic nerve, and in the lower back part of the brain is reformed into letters. Letters then group together into words. You then send that over to a dictionary part of your brain to recognize the word. You put words together. That all happens before the information gets to your conscious mind. At that same time, we can see those specific neural regions that are linked to the creation of the specific pieces of information, the core story elements. We can see those pieces light up and show that by controlling the input, the story-based input, we can isolate those regions and show that what the brain is doing is converting that incoming information into story form, and it happens before the information gets up to the mind, to the conscious mind. So that set of little subregions then had to have a name, so we call it the neural story net. It is those parts of the subconscious mind, those subregions that are involved in the process of converting information into story form in order to make it make sense. The make sense mandate was well established, 40, 50 years ago in psychological world. In the sense, if you can't make sense out of it, you're willing to ignore it. Generally speaking, you're always looking for a reason to ignore information. What we were able to show is that the neural story net has been given, for whatever reason, the job of initially making sense out of incoming information. So therefore, we make sense out of incoming information in story terms. So in order to do that, these are just a few of the changes that we can document being made in that process of initially making sense. And that includes, if you notice, even completely reversing factual information that people are given. And there are some incredible studies that have shown that in play. people read something, they hear something, and in their mind, they read or heard exactly the opposite of what actually was on the paper or what was actually said, and think that is exactly what they were given. So real quick summary on this part. This neural story net, it lies between the outside world and the conscious mind. Its job is to make things make sense, and it's willing and able to distort that incoming information to make it make sense, so that what actually gets to the conscious mind is not necessarily at all what was originally provided in the source material. We can also show that the elements, because it's controlled by the elements of effective story structure, intentionally using those elements in the way you provide the information minimizes that distortion. Quick example. One more. Here's what first gets up to the conscious mind. It's not the original source material, it's this self-created story-based version of the material that was distorted from it in order to make it make sense. The problem is that's the only version that has a chance to exert influence on that particular individual. That is to say, change their attitudes, beliefs, values, knowledge. So that's the version that's going to do your work for you. So a quick demo, and I want to do this real fast. Little fun demo. I'm going to show you 2 lines. Person number 1 says, "Where's John?" Person number 2 says, "Well, I didn't want to say anything, but I saw a green VW parked in front of Carol's." Again, person number 1, "Where's John?" Person number 2, "Well, I didn't want to say anything, but I saw a green VW parked in front of Carol's." What I'd like you to think about for just a moment is what's going on here, and what's the relationship between the 4 human beings who are mentioned. Person number 1 who speaks, person number 2 who speaks, John who's spoken about, and Carol who is spoken about. And then if anyone wants to unmute themselves and blurt out what they think, we'll do that for just a moment before we go on. Any thoughts on what's going on here? What's the relationship of those 4 human beings?
Unfair.
Yeah. Here's what's interesting. The question is, and I bet a lot of you were sort of thinking that same sort of a thing. The question is, how many of you said, "Nope, cannot possibly answer either question because there isn't enough information in what was given to me to answer either one. Don't have a clue, couldn't possibly address either." Truth is, I didn't give you enough information to address in any way either of the 2 questions I asked. That's your neural story net in action, that made a number of assumptions in order to make it make sense. And I'm going to go back and show you what they are. But first, one more quick demo. Picture yourself at an event. You can call it a party, at a conference, I don't know, at some kind of an event. And you're sort of standing in a corner. And very close to you, you hear 2 other people in a conversation. And this is what you hear. Person number 1 says, "Hi, John." Person number 2 says, "Shh, I'm not here. You never saw me. I'm not here." Person number one says, "Oh, it's okay. Carol's gone home." Now, if you heard that, you'd be able to make perfect sense out of it, right? You would assume person number 2 is in fact John. And what John is saying is, keep it quiet. There's certain people I don't want to bump into tonight. Person number 1 who understands the situation is saying, "She's gone home. You're okay. You wimp. You don't have to hide." Right? That's not what it says. If you take what I gave you as literal fact, the only conclusion you can come to is poor person number 2 has lost all touch with reality, been to way too many of the California pot shops because they're circling some other planet than Earth, because person number 2 is in fact here. And you, person number 1, not only have seen them, you're looking at them right now. But rather than deal with that, your mind automatically found a way to flip the meaning of every sentence person number 2 said, because it makes it make sense. Go back to the first demo. If you take this literally, what I gave you, The only conclusion you can come to is poor person number 2 either didn't hear the question or, again, has lost all touch with reality. They were asked about a person and they're talking about a car. There is no connection between them at all, except that your mind requires things to make sense. And so you had to create that connection between John and a green VW. So you could then create a connection between John and Carol, which also isn't referenced at all in here. You probably also assumed, for example, person number 1 and person number 2 are physically co-located, because it doesn't make sense otherwise. Although that's not necessarily the case. This could just be 2 sequential lines on the daily, I don't know, NSA logs of monitoring worldwide communications. And person number 1 could have been talking to someone else in Frankfurt, Germany, and person number 2 could be in Taiwan. And they just happen to come in sequentially in the daily log. But you never even gave yourself a chance to consider that option because it didn't make sense. This make sense mandate is an incredibly powerful thing. And it lies at the heart of most of the miscommunication that happens in the world. One more quick little demo. 3 sentences. He went to the store. Fred died. Sharon went hungry and wept. Can't you feel yourself connecting those together? Can't you feel your mind just linking them all into a story? And you're probably assuming, if nothing else, that he who went to the store is Fred. Notice that you just violated one of the laws of English. Not a suggestion of English, a law of English. A pronoun may only legally refer to a noun that precedes it, not the one that follows it. You don't care. When the laws of English run up against the make sense mandate, the laws of English don't stand a chance. This is incredibly powerful. And it is global. We can find, it's not cultural, it is global. We can document the same elements, the same patterns in all the cultures that have been studied around the globe. So the question is then, come on. What are the elements then that this neural story net uses that form the structures that it uses to, as it's forming its make sense version of incoming information? And the answer is, dominantly there are 8 of them. And often I'll do an hour, hour and a half, 2-hour workshop just on these 8 elements and what they look like and developing them. For right now, for here, I'm just listing them. All narratives are about characters. They're not about events, they are about characters. And it's the characters that populate certain character positions, plural, we'll get to in a minute. Character traits are just information about the character that make those characters relevant to the audience, that is to say, make the audience able to remember and hold on to those characters. Goal, what a character is after, what the character needs or wants to do or get in the story. A goal needs to be something that is real and physical and tangible. Peace is a lousy goal because no one knows what it looks like, really. Happiness is a terrible goal because we don't know what it looks like, so we can't, during the course of receiving information, evaluate whether a character is getting toward that goal or not. Motives. This is where the underlying substructure comes from. A motive is what drives a character to need a goal. It's what makes the goal important to the character. This is where values, beliefs, attitudes, cultural norms, those sorts of things come into play, is in the role of motives. Conflicts and problems are those things that block a character from reaching a goal. If there are no problems, there is no conflict, there is no story. It becomes just a statement of fact because the character would have already reached the goal. Conflicts and problems create risk and danger. And risk and danger are the source of excitement and narrative tension in a story. Risk being the likelihood that something's going to go wrong, in a sense, the probability of failure. Danger is the consequences of something going wrong. It's what happens to you if something goes wrong. The more likely it is that something bad's going to happen, and the greater the consequences of something bad happening, the greater the narrative tension, and generally speaking, the greater the excitement at that moment in the story. Struggles then are when finally plotting elements begin to enter the story. Struggles, that's what a character does to try to overcome problems and conflicts, facing risk and danger, to get to a goal that's important to them. And details refer to, we gather information about the world through our 5 sensory organs. That's the way we gather information about the world. To the extent that you provide that same sensory specific information, details, our minds are geared to be able to make pictures out of it. Those are the 8 elements that the neural story net in your brain uses to build its make sense version of incoming information. So every person that you're communicating with at a subconscious automatic level is looking for those same pieces of information, and where they don't get them will infer them on their own. And they do it amazingly quickly, often on the first sentence of a narrative. They'll figure out where they think it's going, what it's about, what's the core theme, what's the general gist of the story, even though in one sentence they've gotten very, very little information. When we test people in labs, it's amazing how fast that neural story net spins up its own make sense version. So then the picture version: character has a goal, backed by motives, blocked by problems and conflicts that create risk and danger. Character then must struggle to get over, around, or through it. Those are the elements. The good news about those is those are very simple. There's nothing very alien here. There's no need to go back to school for 2 semesters and take advanced courses. Those are all very commonplace elements, but amazingly enough, they're ones especially motives, risk and danger, and to a lesser extent, problems and conflicts get overlooked and grossly underused in our communication and leave the audience to infer those on their own, and they're notoriously bad at doing it. That is to say, they're not bad at doing it, they're bad at inferring things that match what the teller or the writer intended. Bad in that way. The second half of the question is then, I wanted to put in one quick cautionary tale before we jump to the real heart of what I wanted to say. Information alone rarely, if ever, changes human mind. We think if we give them the information, they'll understand. When it's tested, what we find over and over again is as you give them information, they will interpret the information to support their existing beliefs. And if they can't, and that can include making assumptions about the source of the information. But it is very rare that information ever changes minds. What happens is, when we research it, these core beliefs, attitudes, values are stored in story form in long-term memory. And in order to change them, rather than say, your story's wrong and here's a better one, here's some new information that it replaces yours, what you wind up having to do is called story reframing. And that is to say, take the story that they have and alter the structure of it so that it still looks like their story, but is changed in a way that makes them come to your conclusion. At the very end, if I time it out right, we will wind up talking momentarily about reframing. But don't rely on the cautionary tale, don't rely on information to communicate, to change minds and values and attitudes. Taking that.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Oh, sure.
I'm wondering, does that change depending on a person's level of education? Or I'm just imagining a scientist, hopefully that their whole framing is accepting new
Yeah.
information. Does that change depending on kind of profession or education level?
Mhm. Uh, that I know of, there's never been enough research to break it out by field, for example. Generally speaking, education level does not show up as a variable that has a huge impact on that phenomenon. People who are scientists often express what's called healthy skepticism, and so tend to be reluctant to accept new information unless it is consistent in some way with something they were suspecting to begin with. Again, there isn't a whole lot of research that's been done specifically on this question. So I'm going off of a number of fairly small studies and fairly small survey projects. But while their reasoning may be more analytical and therefore more approachable, initially the answer tends to be, no, we're all about the same. The way we initially respond to incoming information that's contrary to our own. The more educated and the more scientifically literate the person is, what seems to happen is that it changes the way that you question or discount or dismiss that new incoming information. And it may change ultimately the way you consider it. But from the little bit of studies that I have seen, initially, we all pretty much react alike. Does that answer your question at all?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. So let's look at then the other half, creating meaning. This is what you really want to do, is control meaning. Meaning really is about influencing other people, that is, say, changing attitudes, beliefs, values, knowledge, in order to change behavior. Ultimately, it's pretty much always what someone does that we're trying to change. The question came up with some Department of Defense funding. Of those elements that exist within the neural Storynet, which ones really control the way stories could exert influence? That is to say, which ones control the way we interpret meaning? And initially we started with fairly simple 2-character stories. On this one, they're still on this slide, but for right now, ignore where it says system character and viewpoint character. They're there, but they're not part of exerting influence, or part of, if they're not there, it can confuse the audience and they tune out, but it doesn't really affect the meaning or influence. We found that these are the elements that exert the greatest impact over creating meaning. A main character in the story has a goal. Goal is what they're after, physical, tangible thing that they're trying to do or get, backed up by some set of motives. The antagonist is just the physical embodiment of the greatest obstacle standing between main character and goal. It doesn't have to be a sentient being. It can be a storm. It can be a mountain. It could be something even fairly amorphous, like prejudiced, or it could be anything. The less it can be linked to something that is vividly visual, a character, a mountain, a stream, a storm, the embodiment of prejudice, if you wanted to go it that way, or race, the embodiment of racism, if you wanted to do that way. The more tangible it is, the more physical it is, the stronger the story. In story terms, those two meet for the last time in this story at the climax of the story. That's the definition of a climax. In a lot of, say, position papers, we say character has a goal, something they need to do, and we say why they need to do it, motive, and then we say, here's what we're going to do. Here's what, and we'll talk about the problems that have to be overcome, those problems representing the antagonist, and we jump straight to what we're going to do, which represents the climax. So even in those little position paper things, those same elements are still there. After the climax, we find out, does the main character achieve their goal? Yes or no? And how do they feel about it? And that's that residual resolution emotion thing. And this being Department of Defense money, there's only one thing they like better than acronyms, and that's metrics. And so they kept pushing. Give us, we want numbers, we want metrics. So I kept saying, this is story. They kept saying, you want funding, we want metrics. I said, give you metrics. And so we realized that the main character, the antagonist, and the way that the audience feels at the end of the story seem to dominate everything else. And so I developed a really simple equation. Initially, I thought I was being sarcastic when I did it. Influence potential equals that residual resolution emotion times the difference between two factors, one that relates to the main character, the way the audience feels about the main character, and one that how they relate to the antagonist. And we started testing it and found that it was freakishly accurate. And that on these simple stories, we could calculate, knowing a little bit about the next audience that was coming in to test a story, calculate exactly how memorable it would be, how impactful the story would be. When we brought them back into the lab 3 months after they first heard the story, we would be able to anticipate whether or not they would actually remember the story, and when we rewired them up and they retold the story, whether or not they would feel the same type of and nearly the same magnitude of emotion that they felt when they first heard the story. So we got cocky and started to expand it to multiple character stories, and found out that there were always outlier groups all of a sudden, that there would be clusters of people that would react very differently to the story than we anticipated. And so we realized that not everyone links into and identifies with the main character of a story. So the first question is, who's this story really about for me? How bad is the ending of the story for that character, and who do I blame for it if it's bad? If it's good, who gets the credit? And particularly if it's bad, who should have changed the way the story ended? Who had the power to change it and didn't do it? Or if they did use it and the story came out the way I wanted it to, then that's who gets the credit. So we realized that there is a character position that's never really been accounted for in any of the work on story before, and that is this climax character. A hero can be a climax character, but a hero typically is also the main character of the story. A quick example of a climax character. John Wayne is leading a wagon train setting out from St. Louis on the Oregon Trail. It's 2 months, they're gonna get to Oregon, and they're all farmers and a couple of merchants in the wagon train, and he's leading it because he's in love with the school marm. That's his goal, is to settle down with the school marm. So he wants to lead this wagon train successfully across the Oregon Trail. 5 days out from St. Louis, they are attacked by Indians. They're surrounded. Flaming arrows are coming in. They circle up the wagons. But these are farmers, and they don't have a lot of weapons, and people are being shot with arrows. And John Wayne has 4 arrows in him, and he's out of bullets, and he's down to picking up rocks with his one good arm and throwing them at the Indians. You think, oh, woe is us. Woe is us. John Wayne is going to die. All the settlers are going to die. The school arm's going to be violated. And at that moment, you hear a little, you see the pennants come up over the top of the hill, and here comes the cavalry in to save the day. They are the climax character. They're not the main character, but we recognized they're the ones that had the power to control the story. And we realized that for influence purposes, it's not necessarily the main character, it's the character that your target audience identifies with the most. So technically, and if you want to write novels, this is really fun to play with, you have two complete storylines. One for the main character and one for the character that you want your audience to identify with. And they interact over time. There are elements of the story that are structural, like the climax of the story, that is defined as when the main character confronts for the final time the antagonist blocking the main character from their goal. The climax, of course, then maybe will or won't have anything to do with the identity character. I don't have time. A 2-minute example of this. And then I want to go to kind of what do we find and what's the point and how do you use it? You know the story of, good one, Peter Pan. Okay, Peter Pan, main character of the story, flies into London, and he sees Wendy in her room, and he says, "Hey, hubba, hubba, hubba," and he goes in and does his little thing and invites her to go to his island. And she, being a good English girl, takes her two brothers along. They go to the island, and there he kind of, he wanted her to be there to, presumably, cook, clean house, take care of the lost boys, tidy things up. He goes out and plays with Captain Hook, his antagonist. So let's go back up 2 slides, one more slide. So Captain Hook is his antagonist, and they play. The climax of the story is the last time that Captain Hook and Peter play together. At that moment, the climax character in that story, for some odd reason, is suddenly this crocodile that comes out of nowhere, that has swallowed the clock, that drives off Captain Hook. Peter doesn't have really the ability or even the interest in destroying Captain Hook. The crocodile does. The crocodile is the climax character. Hook is gone. Peter wins and says to Wendy, "Gee, that was fun, go home," and sends her back home. And you think, cute story, unless you were an English girl at the turn of the century, between the 19th and 20th century, and you really identified with Wendy. Look at that story from her point of view. And here comes this boy flying in the window, and he's kind of cute, and he's a little awkward and geeky. But there are pluses here. One, he can fly, so none of your girlfriends have a boyfriend who can fly. You won't get stuck, in traffic jams going to the movies because he just flies right overhead. And there's got to be some family money around because he has his own island. So there's potential here, and you say, all right, I'll go check out his island and check him out. But being a good English girl, I'll take my two brothers along. Who's her faux character? Who is Wendy fighting? It's not Captain Hook. He didn't care about Captain Hook. She's fighting Tinkerbell. What are they fighting over? Peter. It's a love triangle. We have here the quintessential rule-following English girl, Wendy, and a 4-inch high, narcissistic, bitchy fairy, Tinkerbell. And it's their two value systems that are at war over Peter. We come to the end of the story. The crocodile drives off Captain Hook. And what does Peter say to Wendy? Thanks for coming, go home. And you realize, if you identified with Wendy, that your whole value system, that very rigid system that you were told you had to live in, has just gotten a slap in the face and been shown to be totally ineffective. Your reaction to the material would be radically different than what the author intended. If you are the author, you can't afford to have your audiences walk away giving you credit for having created a radically different emotional response in them than you intended. The whole idea of story science is to be able to control the response of your audience so that they respond the way you intended. That will not happen randomly. So we get to really the practical story influence line, I'll come back one, which is just to force every audience member to identify with and view the story through the eyes of your main character. Then they'll adopt the goal, motive, antagonist that you want and have a much better chance of emotionally responding the way you want, which means that in that little, that influence potential equation, you'll be able to exert the influence that you are pre-calculating yourself to do. How do you do that? One is by choosing main characters that your target audience is going to identify with anyway. Use what we call motive matching. The way that we test audiences that they start to identify with and empathize with characters is primarily by trying to compare the motives of that character to their own. Often those are implied. They're not stated in the story. So we infer them. And this is where the target audience takes over complete control of your story. If you don't articulate the motives for the characters that you include in your material, be they real characters or fictional characters, everyone in the audience will always infer them. And we research it primarily when people infer motives, they infer motives that are far more self-serving, narcissistic, even cruel and sadistic than are the actual motives of a character, which means that they will respond differently to your characters than you intended for them to do. And then controlling the expectations, and again, we haven't gone into this, how to control the expectations of the audience so that you set them up correctly to respond at the end, at the resolution point of the story if you want. The point of all of this is just to say that the research that we've been doing over the last, particularly the last decade, compiled on top of a couple of millennium of story research before that, have identified very specific concepts, tools, and relationships that are available now to you to use to better control the way your audiences respond to the material that you want to create, and give you a new way to look at creating your material. So you're creating it specifically to create the response that you want, rather than just creating what you want to say. It's flipping the way that you approach your own material, so that you're looking at it from the viewpoint of the audience and the way that you want them to respond, the way that you want to influence them, change attitudes, beliefs, values, knowledge, so you can change their behavior. And then creating your material specifically to have that impact. That's what I wanted to go over. We can take time that's left for any questions, comments, or, oh yeah.
I do have one, if you can hear me.
I can.
Okay, so I'm Sandy, and I actually want to go back to an issue you raised before and tie it into the end of your presentation. Because the one question you had came about the time when you said that pretty much giving new information alone rarely, if ever, changes the human mind.
Yep.
And you started to elaborate on that by talking about how you should reframe it. But I would love for you to cement that. How do you reframe what you have so that you can change their mind? Because it ties in with the last thing you said. If we want them to get the message, how do we reframe it? What do we do to help change their minds?
And actually, it's using the elements in this model, this influence line model I gave you. Let me give you one example, and then this will take about 2 minutes on story reframing. I put this in here, and I wasn't sure if we would have time for it, but one example, and I think an example is a better teacher of what reframing looks like. This is an actual example, happened a couple of years ago. The Maricopa County, that's Phoenix, Arizona. The county assessor called me and this is now the real short version of it, he was running for re-election. When he had been elected his first time, he had promised to update the assessor's office and revamp the whole thing and make it more user-friendly, blah, 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 like politicians do all the time. He was now running for re-election and hadn't done any of it. But he had just gotten a big grant from the state to completely revamp all of the computer systems and all of the operation systems in the assessor's office there in that county, and was trying to use that as the tool that would get him reelected. So the story that he was telling was this: he, the assessor, his goal was to accurately assess property in the county because that was his job. But he had this lack of tools, and the new technology that he was buying was going to be his way to beat the inefficiencies and the poor performance of his office. I mean, typically properties didn't get looked at but once every 5 years, and that was by a guy driving down the street who would take pictures of a property from the street, and that was all that they knew. If you challenge an assessment or a reassessment, it often took 2 years to adjudicate it. He now said, with this new technology and the new tools he was buying included airplanes that would fly over every property every year and take accurate three-dimensional pictures of every property, accurate to within I think it was 1/8 of an inch, and use those for updating the assessment. He would also have a fleet of drones, so that if anyone challenged an assessment, within 1 hour, he would have a drone flying over that property that would take a picture accurate to a 32nd of an inch of every building, every development, everything that was on that property, have that back in computer analyzed, and within 2 hours after that, you would have your adjudication. He thought everyone would love it. He started getting boos. His ratings in the opinion, the polls were tanking. He started to get threats on his life. People said that if he or any of his planes or drones showed up over their neighborhood, they would shoot them down. This is Phoenix, Arizona, so you take that sort of a thing literally. That's when he came to me and said, I don't get it. This is what they said they wanted. And I said, all right, let's look at the story you're telling and the story they're hearing, and then reframe your story so that they'll hear your story the way you intend. That's the story that he was telling. It took me about an hour, although I billed him for a whole lot more than that. But it didn't take me very long, literally, to interview a few people who had heard his talks and get the story that they were hearing. First, they didn't identify with him. They identified with the property owner. Why? That's what they were. Mention the assessor to a property owner, and the goal is always to minimize the assessed value of my property. Why? It reduces my tax burden, which is my ultimate motive. Who then is the enemy? Who's the antagonist? The assessor, because he's the one that keeps upping my assessed value. So who, in effect, do I look at as the climax character, as the one who has the power to beat the assessor? Someone who successfully cheats. And so with the assessor saying he was bringing in all this new technology that would catch cheaters, the residual resolution emotion that people were feeling was both angry and outraged, and they wanted to vote him out of office. The story they were hearing was the assessor wants to spy on us and raise our taxes. Oh, I just jumped ahead. He said the story he wanted to say. They heard something radically different. The question was, how do you get them to hear the story that he wanted to say? How does he reframe his story to be able to talk about the value of all this new technology and his new computer systems, and make people realize the value of it for them? We have to reframe the story. To reframe, you change either the goal of the character, you change the main character, and or the goal, and or the motive. You can then sometimes, and typically what will happen is you'll flip who gets put in the antagonist position. Notice he put himself in the main character position, told a story about himself. It is incredibly common when you tell a story about you or your office or your organization for your target audience to flip that story in their mind, so that instead of being main character, you will become antagonist, as what happened to him. So how do you reframe the story? One, don't tell it from his point of view, because nobody cares about his point of view. They care about their own. So I had to get him to shift main character to be the property owner, and then change the goal. And I got him to change the goal to this: you don't want to pay someone else's taxes, do you? And of course, the answer is no. But the assessor doesn't assess how much tax gets levied. He only distributes it out equitably across the county according to property value, which means that if somebody cheats and doesn't pay their fair share, somebody else has to. And so by reframing the way he told the story, changing the point of view of the story, and changing the goal of that character in the minds of his target audience, he flips the story so that the cheaters become the antagonist, because they're forcing honest property owners to pay more tax. And he becomes the climax character, he with the power to make the main character's goal play out the way that the main character wants it to. That's reframing. It's taking the story you wanted to tell and saying, wait a minute, knowing what I know about my target audience, how will they hear this? Will they hear it the way I want it to? And how do I reframe my story so that I can provide the same information? And for him, it was, we have all this new technology, it's coming online, we're going to be much more efficient, we'll be faster, we'll be fairer. That was his story. But how do you say that so that your audience hears it the way you want them to? That's reframing. That's an example of reframing. Does that help at all with your question?
Yes, thank you. That's very good.
Okay.
Great.
Others?
Ken, does the outline with the points at all track with something that I think goes across culture, and that's the hero's journey?
Yes. The hero's journey fits within this framework. Typically in the hero's journey, the hero is the climax character and the main character, both. And at times, depending on how the hero's journey is set up, the hero is also his own worst enemy that he must overcome. So the hero in that situation can occupy three of those character positions: main character, antagonist, and climax character. Usually in the hero's journey, most commonly in the hero's journey, what happens is that at some point along the path, the hero realizes that his original goal is meaningless and has a goal substitution. Substitutes one goal for another that becomes a much loftier goal that involves behavior consistent with what we think is heroic. Serving other people, being in service of others, so that by at some point in the process of struggling to overcome problems and conflicts and face risk and danger, that character, our main character, has a goal shift, and then having had that goal shift, is able to become what we call the hero. That is to say, step into the role of climax character. The reason I leave climax character as a very neutral position, in many stories, the arch villain is the climax character. In many real world stories, if you want to cause a riot, if you want people on the street, have a story where they identify strongly with the main character. They care about and empathize with the main character, and the main character never reaches their goal because the antagonist stomps on them. Particularly if they do it if they cheat or do something unfair to win and make the main character lose. And you can have, we were tracking stories from Al-Qaeda and from the Taliban and from ISIS, and mapping them over for a DoD project over about a 15-year period. We're taking stories over a 15-year period. And every one of the stories that was listed as a primary recruiting and fundraising vehicle for 4 or 5 of those organizations was a story where the Climax character was the villain. And they usually put the US in that role as being the villain. And so that for their target audiences, stories where the US won and stomped unfairly on some character that would be an identity character for their target audience became a prime way that they were able to put riots out in the street, to recruit new people, and to fundraise. So negative ending stories actually create more immediate and more dramatic behavioral shifts than do positive ending stories. However, negative ending stories tend not to have long-term behavior, attitudinal, belief, value changes in the character. They make you angry, you do something, and then you go back to exactly the way you were before. Strongly positive ending stories have the potential for long-term belief, attitude, value shifts that over time create behavioral shifts, but they tend not to show up very quickly.
Great. So Ken, if I can jump in here.
Thank you.
Yeah, this has been great. And we ran a little bit over our time, which is wonderful because I wanted to hear some more. So want to thank everyone for showing up today. Thank you, Ken, for this great stuff. And one of the things that maybe some people are saying is, what does this have to do with knowledge management? And I can tell you, trying to change people's minds and reframing knowledge management sometimes can be, tough. And we use stories in knowledge management a lot. So hope this is helpful. And go ahead and, do you have any last words, Ken?
If I haven't said it by now, no, I'll go with what I've already put up on the tape, and let that live.
Perfect.
That
Okay.
be it.
Yeah, great. And if anyone has any more questions, just they can reach out.
Oh
to
yeah,
you.
certainly.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you all for this meeting, and we'll go ahead and shut off the recording and let you all have your day. And thank you so much, Ken, for coming by.
Thank you. Have a good day.
All right.
Thank you for watching KMCDC's presentation. Hope to see you at the next monthly meeting.